Welcome to Story Master. In the next few minutes, you're going to witness a true story where one decision changes everything, where power shifts, plans collapse, and history turns on a single moment. Stay to the end, because the final twist always hits harder when you know what came before. On December 13, 1872, a battered brigantine slid into the port of Gibraltar like a creature that had survived something it shouldn't have. Her paint was salt-worn, her canvas tired, and her story, though no one in the harbor understood it yet, was already becoming legend. She came in under the control of just 3 men. Not because she was a small ship. Not because she was an easy ship. But because she had been found alone in the Atlantic, drifting as if the ocean itself had been steering her toward a witness. Her name was Mary Celeste. And by the time those 3 men brought her under the shadow of Gibraltar's rock, the question that would haunt the world had already taken root: what happened to the captain, his wife, his young child, and the crew who had sailed with them? Not what rumor said. Not what later storytellers embellished. Not what the most popular retellings insisted had occurred in some romantic instant. But what actually happened, what the surviving evidence can still support, after decades of repetition blurred the edges into ghost story shorthand. Ships vanished in the age of sail. They vanished with tragic regularity. Some were swallowed by storms so fierce they snapped masts like matchsticks and smashed hulls into splinters. Some were pulled under by fire, by collision, by ice, by reef, by human error. Some simply sailed out past the horizon and never came back, leaving only unanswered letters, unpaid debts, and empty chairs at kitchen tables. That kind of disappearance was common enough to become a grim expectation for coastal communities. But the Mary Celeste belonged to a rarer category, the kind of mystery that resists the tidy explanation of bad weather and bad luck. Because when she was discovered, she was not a shattered wreck. She was not a charred carcass. She was not upside down and half sunk, her decks scraped clean by waves. She was still afloat. Still capable, in theory, of finishing the journey she had begun. And almost everything that mattered, cargo, provisions, personal belongings, was still aboard. The ship's people, however, were gone. To understand why that detail is so unsettling, you have to step backward, past Gibraltar, past the salvage hearing, past the rumors that grew like mold in damp corners, back to the first time this vessel ever met the water. Her story begins far from the Mediterranean and far from the myth. It begins in Nova Scotia, in the Bay of Fundy, where the tides rise and fall with an almost unnatural force. The Bay of Fundy doesn't merely change, it transforms. Shorelines shift. Mudflats appear and disappear. Water climbs and retreats like a living thing. Along those waters in the 19th century, shipbuilding was not a romantic profession, it was survival, economy, pride, and inheritance. Communities built ships the way other places built farms, as a collective endeavor and an unspoken gamble. The Bay of Fundy produced countless vessels, many humble, many hard-working, most forgotten. Coastal schooners hauling timber, coal, fish, and goods between small ports. Practical craft for practical lives. Yet the same waters that produced ships also consumed them. A disturbing number vanished without leaving a wreck, a corpse, or even a scrap of identifiable debris. Bay of Fundy men grew up with that possibility in their bones. In 1860, a Nova Scotian shipbuilder named Joshua Dewis, an experienced builder of smaller local vessels, looked to expand. He had been born in the town of Economy and had worked the shipbuilding trade along the Minas Basin. His earlier builds were typically under 100 tons, intended for regional trade, sturdy enough for local waters, not designed for drama. But the industry was evolving. Ships were getting bigger. Opportunities were expanding beyond the familiar coastline. Dewis wanted to move and to grow. He relocated his work from Economy down toward Advocate Harbor on Cape d'Or, a rugged area exposed to Atlantic weather. Yet there was another location nearby that offered something Advocate could not: Spencer's Island. Spencer's Island is not, despite its name, actually an island. It is a settlement on the mainland, named for a real island offshore. What mattered was geography. Spencer's Island sat on a more protected side of Cape d'Or, sheltered from the worst coastal punishment. It also offered an advantage that mattered even more in the 19th century: timber. While some nearby communities had stripped the forests around their shipyards over the years, Spencer's Island still had trees close to the shoreline, timber that could be felled, hauled, shaped, and used without the expense and delay of long transport. In an era when lumber was the skeleton of every vessel, this was gold. It also helped that Spencer's Island was a tight-knit community, knitted together through marriage and blood. Much of the surrounding woodland was controlled by two brothers, Jacob and Isaac Spicer. And in the way small communities often functioned, business and family overlapped. Joshua Dewis's wife was the sister of the Spicers' wives. Dewis convinced them to invest. The Spicers would supply timber and in return would receive shares in the first vessel built at the new yard. Sometime in the fall of 1860, the keel was laid, timber placed on the slipway as a spine for a ship that would soon have ribs and skin. The intention was to launch with the spring tides. But first, the vessel had to survive winter. The shipyard itself was simple, primitive by later standards. There was no modern mill on site. Timber arrived and was shaped by hand. Axes, saws, labor. Plans existed, but not in the neat blueprints of an industrial age. A great deal of shipbuilding was still skill, pattern memory, and experience. Workers lodged where they could. There were no dedicated bunkhouses. Some stayed in the homes of company men, sleeping on floors, crowding into rooms, living inside the same walls as the families funding the build. By early December, the hull's framework stood exposed. The ribs were raised. The skeleton of the ship waited, left open to the winter elements, not out of neglect but out of practice, seasoning the wood, letting moisture escape, hardening the structure. Then the workers went on leave for the season. Over winter, Dewis and the Spicers gathered the materials needed to finish the vessel when the weather broke. When spring finally returned, the hull was planked and completed. Salt was used in drying the wood. Sails were imported, likely from regional centers like Halifax or Windsor. And when the ship was ready, they gave her a name. At launch she was not called Mary Celeste. She was Amazon. Why Joshua Dewis chose the name is unclear. Dramatic retellings love to push the idea that he chose it because the ship was fierce, or because it was cursed, or because some omen occurred on launch day. But the plain truth is less theatrical: the ship launched successfully. No credible record confirms a catastrophic mishap on the slipway. In later years, posters from Spencer's Island launches would advertise festivities, tea, small sales, community gathering, suggesting launches were social events, moments of pride. In that atmosphere, Amazon slid into the water as a symbol, the first major vessel of the yard, a promise of prosperity. The ship itself was a brigantine rigged with 2 masts, 2 deckhouses, a square stern. About 99 feet long, with a breadth around 25.5 feet. Gross tonnage roughly 200, solid for Bay of Fundy construction but not extraordinary in the wider world. The stern bore the name Amazon and her home port of registration, Parsboro, Nova Scotia. A new ship. A new yard. A new beginning. And then, almost immediately, death. Her first captain was Robert McClellan, recently married. The plan was simple: sail to the nearby community of 5 islands, load lumber, then cross the Atlantic to London, bringing Canadian timber to the River Thames. McClellan had been sick already, but he believed the sea air would help him. Sailors often did. They trusted the ocean even when it was cruel. The ship loaded, Amazon set out into the Bay of Fundy, and before she even cleared it, McClellan's condition collapsed into pneumonia. The first mate turned the ship back toward Spencer's Island. McClellan was brought ashore and carried into the home of Jacob Spicer, one of the owners. There, in that house overlooking the shipyard that had just built the Amazon, the young captain died. The ship returned to sea carrying the first cargo of her career, her captain's body. She sailed to the town of Economy, McClellan's home port. As Amazon approached the wharf, the captain's widow ran down to the shoreline, expecting perhaps some delay, some trouble, anything but what awaited her. The crew never forgot the scene. Grief on the shore. The ship barely launched and already a funeral carriage. McClellan was buried in the Economy cemetery. And Amazon sailed on under a new captain. Jack Parker took command. He brought the ship across the Atlantic as originally intended. But even then, the vessel seemed to attract trouble like iron draws lightning. Before the long crossing, Amazon anchored at Eastport, Maine, where she became snagged on fishing wires and required repair. She eventually crossed to London, unloaded lumber, took on cargo for Portugal, and sailed down the Thames into the Strait of Dover, where she collided with another vessel, a British brig. The brig sank quickly, heaving and rolling as her crew abandoned ship. The Amazon stayed afloat. The men from the sinking brig climbed aboard her, shocked and alive. Amazon carried them to Dover and then went in for repairs again. She went to Lisbon. She went to Marseille. She continued her Atlantic trade, moving goods and returning home, now under Captain William Thompson. For years she sailed, not always smoothly, but at least successfully enough to remain in service. Then in 1867, after carrying corn from Baltimore to Halifax, the owners began to sour on Captain Thompson. While Amazon lay in Halifax, they notified him, "Hold the ship, a replacement captain is coming." Thompson responded by doing something that would ripple through Spencer's Island like a betrayal. He discharged one of the owner's sons, George Spicer, put him off the ship in Halifax, and then took the vessel north, empty, toward Cape Breton, in violation of the kind of caution that sailors respected. It was November, and Nova Scotia winters were no joke. Insurance policies at the time could, and did, include specific restrictions, because the risk was known. The waters around Cape Breton after November 1st were dangerous enough that insurers sometimes forbade voyages there. Thompson anchored near Big Glacé Bay, awaiting coal. Then, as expected, a strong gale rose. Amazon was driven ashore. Thompson reported to the owners that the ship was badly damaged, crippled, and would require expensive repairs. But the insurance company refused to cover the cost because Thompson had violated the policy by sailing into that region after the cutoff date. The Spencer's Island owners faced a hard choice. Without insurance, repairs would be financially devastating. For a small community, a major vessel was livelihood. Losing it was not merely a business problem, it was an economic wound. They abandoned the ship. Then things became suspicious. A new owner claimed the Amazon quickly, almost too quickly, and re-registered her to a new port. Under Nova Scotia law at the time, a ship should not have been re-registered if she was unseaworthy. Yet within a short period she was not only claimed but transferred again, suggesting the ship's condition was better than Thompson had reported. The implication was ugly. Thompson may have lied about the extent of damage, arranged a quiet transfer, and effectively cheated the owners out of their vessel. In Spencer's Island, the loss stung so badly that people later called Amazon the ship that made them eat with tin spoons, a bitter phrase for hard times. From there, the ship's misfortune continued. She was resold. She wrecked again, this time in Maine. She was salvaged and towed to New York for auction. She sold for a paltry sum, $1,750, to a man named Richard W. Haynes. And it was Haynes who gave her the name that would echo through history. Mary Celeste. Exactly why he chose it is uncertain, interpretations vary, but the name carried a religious tone, Mary of Heaven, Heavenly Mary, something pure and protective, almost as if one could rename bad luck away. Haynes registered the ship in New York, but because she had originally been built and registered as a foreign vessel, bringing her under an American flag required import duties. Those fees mattered. The paperwork mattered. Haynes, however, did not pay them. Instead, he attempted a trick. He claimed the ship had been rebuilt so extensively it was effectively new. New keel. New stern. Major replacement of the hull. He suggested that the cost of repairs was so high it exceeded what it would have cost to build her from scratch. Historians have argued about whether he truly did it. A skeptical view is that he exaggerated. Either way, the ship's finances were a mess. Haynes sailed as her captain, but the ship dragged him into debt. Within 10 months she was seized for a sheriff's sale. Then James Winchester entered the story. Winchester was a former sea captain whose own life strangely mirrored the ship's path, born in Nova Scotia, later moving through Eastport, Maine, becoming American, finally settling in New York City. He purchased the Mary Celeste, likely believing he had acquired a bargain, a ship with work left in her. But almost immediately, he was confronted by a deputy surveyor who told him the previous owner had not paid the import fees, making the ship's registration fraudulent. The surveyor offered a convenient solution: pay the fee in cash immediately and the problem goes away, refuse and face legal trouble. It was, in plain terms, blackmail. Winchester refused to play along. The case escalated. The vessel became entangled in the system. Winchester fought and ultimately won. But the victory did not solve the ship's deeper issue, rot. The Mary Celeste was discovered to be in worse shape than advertised. Whether Haynes had lied about repairs or simply failed to fix what mattered, Winchester now faced a costly rebuild if he wanted a vessel worth sending across an ocean. He paid for it. The ship was stripped down to the waterline and rebuilt. An additional deck was added, rigging altered, tonnage increased. She went from roughly 200 tons to around 282. It was an expensive transformation, over $11,000, a brutal sum in that era. Winchester's finances took a hit. To absorb the cost, he sold a third share of the ship to a Massachusetts captain named Benjamin Briggs. Briggs would command her next voyage. Benjamin Spooner Briggs was not a reckless man chasing glory. By the accounts we have, he was steady, disciplined, and deeply rooted in the moral culture of his time. An American through and through, with ancestry reaching back to early colonial history. Not a pirate, not a gambler, not a man who drank himself into danger. A family man. And perhaps that is what makes the Mary Celeste's disappearance so unsettling. If the captain had been notorious, the mystery would feel easier. If he had been violent, unstable, or desperate, people could file the event away under "men do terrible things." But Briggs was not that kind of figure. He had a wife, Sarah, his childhood sweetheart. He had children, an 8-year-old son named Arthur and a 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. Arthur remained behind for school, staying with grandparents. Sarah and little Sophia came aboard for the voyage, because for many captains, long passages were lonely and dangerous, and family company was a comfort that made the ship feel like home. The Mary Celeste waited at Pier 50 on the East River through October into November of 1872, preparing for a journey from New York to Genoa, Italy, via Gibraltar. The ship's home during those days was the pier itself. The Briggs family lived aboard while docked. They played music on a small instrument brought with them. They wrote letters. They hosted brief visits from family. Briggs, missing his son, considered sending for him so he could join the voyage, an idea he ultimately didn't pursue. Into the ship's hold went a cargo that would later attract intense scrutiny: 171 barrels of alcohol. Industrial alcohol, volatile, capable of creating fumes. The barrels were stowed on their sides, wedged to prevent rolling. Transporting alcohol was always a risk. If fumes built up in a sealed hold, it could become dangerous. Ventilation mattered. On Tuesday, November 5th, the Mary Celeste was towed from the pier to begin her journey. But fog and wind forced Briggs to anchor off Staten Island for 2 nights, waiting for clearer conditions. During that pause, Sarah wrote a final letter home to her mother-in-law, an ordinary act that would later become a chilling timestamp. Then the weather improved. The ship raised anchor and moved out into the Atlantic. Another ship sat nearby in the New York region, with an eerie symmetry that later storytellers would seize upon. The Dei Gratia, similar in tonnage and build, also carrying a Latin name, by the grace of God. She departed later, on November 15, from Hoboken, New Jersey, bound for Genoa with a cargo of petroleum. She was under the command of Captain David Morehouse. It has often been rumored that Morehouse and Briggs were friends, but proof is thin, and the conduct of the men later does not necessarily suggest intimacy. Friendship, after all, is not how you typically respond when you find the likely grave of a fellow captain and feel mostly excitement about salvage money. The two ships traveled similar routes but not together. Dei Gratia left 8 days after Mary Celeste, roughly 1,200 miles behind. Both encountered harsh Atlantic weather. Storms battered them. They stayed battened down, hatches secured, ships creaking under stress. The Azores appeared around 20 days out for the vessels in that region, though their precise paths differed, one north, one south. The storm that hit Dei Gratia in her first week would have hit Mary Celeste earlier along her own track. Then, on the afternoon of December 5, Captain Morehouse spotted sails about 5 miles off his port bow. Through a glass he saw something wrong immediately: erratic movement, sails in poor order, and no one visible at the helm. The ship did not respond to hails. It drifted like an animal without a mind. Morehouse ordered an investigation. His first mate, Oliver DeVoe, and second mate, John Wright, went over with a seaman, John Johnson. They boarded the mystery ship. Johnson stayed with the boat while the mates climbed onto the deck. It was the Mary Celeste. This is where myth often overwrites reality. Many popular versions claim the ship was perfectly on course, that dinner was still hot, that the logbook ended at the very minute she was found. None of that is supported by the earliest testimony. The truth is stranger and colder, and it matters. DeVoe observed sails in disorder, some damaged and hanging. It looked as if some had been lowered in haste. The deck was empty. The cat was nowhere to be seen. A section of railing on the port side was missing. The first mate checked the pumps; they worked. But when he examined the hold, he found roughly 3.5 feet of water sloshing inside. Not enough to sink her immediately, but enough to raise questions. Inside the cabin, everything was wet. Some windows had been covered with boards and canvas, a storm measure, consistent with rough weather. But the cabin skylight was propped open, allowing rain to pour in. That explained much of the soaking. The beds had been slept in and not made. That detail, small, domestic, almost insulting in its normality, suggested departure in the morning, soon after waking. Sarah Briggs was not the kind of woman who would likely leave the bed unmade for long. The impression of the child was reportedly still visible where she had slept, a haunting trace of innocence on a ship that now felt like a stage after the actors vanished. Food and water remained. Personal belongings remained. Nothing about the ship suggested a violent struggle. No blood on deck. No hacked doors. No evidence of pirates tearing through the cabins in a frenzy. The cargo was still present. The crew had not stripped the ship of valuables as if fleeing with loot. The ship's official log had entries up to November 24, about 10 days before discovery. But there was also a slate, a kind of daily note board used for rough entries before transcription into the formal book. That slate contained the beginning of an entry for November 25. It mattered because it represented the last heartbeat of routine, one more day starting like any other, before the silence. And then that slate was erased by the very act of salvage. Morehouse and his officers talked it over. They could not tow the Mary Celeste. But DeVoe believed she was close to seaworthy. Morehouse agreed to put her under DeVoe's command, providing 2 men, navigational tools, a boat, and limited provisions. Within hours, DeVoe and his tiny crew managed to get her into functional condition, pump some water, set sail, and begin the long push toward Gibraltar. Dei Gratia continued on. Mary Celeste followed, a ghost ship now captained by the man who had boarded her as an intruder. During this passage, Devoe continued the ship's log, using the slate and, in doing so, wiping away the partial November 25 notes left by Briggs. That last fragment of Briggs's immediate awareness was lost forever, erased by chalk and necessity. A storm rose again. The Mary Celeste delayed outside Gibraltar briefly for weather, then entered the strait and port only one day after Dei Gratia. The fact that 3 men could bring a damaged, drifting vessel 600 miles into port is not a small achievement. It also became, inevitably, a reason for suspicion. Courts do not like neat miracles. They search for motive. The ship was seized pending investigation. The authorities in Gibraltar faced a puzzle that felt impossible: a seaworthy vessel, a valuable cargo, and 10 missing people. Their first instinct, like the instinct of almost every later observer, was foul play. They searched the ship top to bottom. A sword was found under Captain Briggs's bed. Investigators at the time claimed it had blood. Chemical tests did not confirm blood. The blade was rusty, something expected on any seagoing weapon in a damp cabin. Other claims came and went as the hearing dragged on, shaped not only by evidence but by fear, greed, and the shadow of blame. And this is where the Mary Celeste story splits into 2 distinct tracks: the enduring public myth and the stubborn, limited chain of facts. Public myth demands drama. It demands a villain. It demands an act that makes sense of the emptiness. Over the decades, theories multiplied: mutiny, murder for insurance, pirates, sea monsters, underwater earthquakes, waterspouts, secret passengers, madness, and even aliens. Some theories accused Winchester of hiring killers for insurance, yet there was no struggle, and killing everyone aboard without leaving a trace while also leaving valuables behind makes little practical sense. Others accused the Dei Gratia crew of ambushing the Mary Celeste for salvage, yet there was again no sign of struggle, and Dei Gratia was slower and unlikely to hunt her down with precision. Still others proposed that Briggs himself staged the event and disappeared, but he left his 8-year-old son behind, a detail that collapses most planned disappearance fantasies unless you're willing to believe he abandoned his child intentionally for a scheme. The most culturally influential fictional retelling came in 1884, when an anonymous author wrote a short story featuring a ship called the Mary Celeste, misspelled, and filled it with invented passengers and dramatic violence. The author was Arthur Conan Doyle. It was fiction, designed to entertain. But fiction has a way of contaminating memory, and Doyle's version added fuel to the myth that the ship had been discovered with meals untouched and horror frozen mid-action. It wasn't true, but it was vivid. Vividness often beats accuracy. So if we set rumor aside, what remains? We remain with a ship found drifting, damaged but afloat. We remain with water in the hold. We remain with evidence of storm precautions. We remain with the skylight open, rain pouring in. We remain with the absence of a boat. We remain with sails partly set, which would allow the ship to continue moving and even accelerate with the wind, important, because a boat tied to the ship could be dragged or snapped away. We remain with a gap in the log. We remain with a missing crew who left behind clothing, possessions, and supplies. And we remain with one chilling probability: they left the ship intentionally. Not because someone forced them at knife point. Not because the ship was already sinking beyond hope. But because they believed, right then, that staying aboard was more dangerous than leaving. That question, what fear could outweigh abandoning a ship, pulls us toward the most grounded explanation, one that does not require monsters or conspiracies. It requires only the realities of 19th-century seamanship, weather, cargo hazards, and a single decision made under pressure. The cargo was alcohol. Alcohol produces fumes. Wooden barrels can leak. Temperature changes matter. Storms matter. Sealed holds matter. If a ship rides through heavy weather with hatches closed for days, fumes can accumulate. And if those fumes reach a certain concentration, they can create an explosion risk, especially if any flame is introduced, even accidentally, through lamps. Now picture the timeline that fits the evidence without stretching it into fantasy. The Mary Celeste departs New York in early November. She anchors briefly, then proceeds into the Atlantic. She encounters storms. The ship is thrown violently. Cargo shifts, barrels rub, pressure changes. After days of bad weather, the crew finally experiences a break. A chance to open hatches and ventilate the hold. A responsible crew would think about this, especially if they had noticed strange sounds or odors. The log reportedly mentioned rumbling in the hold at points, details that suggest awareness of cargo behavior. On the morning of November 25th, Briggs may have seen an opportunity. Calm enough to risk opening the hold. Necessary enough to attempt it. If fumes had built up, opening hatches could release them suddenly. Some modern explanations note that a release of vapor pressure in a wooden ship can produce a groaning, creaking, deflation effect as internal pressure equalizes, a weird, unsettling sound that could easily be interpreted as structural failure by men already strained by weeks of storm and exhaustion. If fumes were strong, symptoms could follow: dizziness, headaches, nausea. And with a 2-year-old child aboard, Briggs's threshold for risk would be lower than a lone cargo captain's. He had his wife and daughter in those cabins. If he believed an explosion was possible, he might choose to remove everyone from the ship temporarily until the hold cleared. That would explain haste. That would explain beds left unmade. That would explain a skylight opened. That would explain some sails lowered rather than neatly stowed. That would explain why valuables and supplies stayed aboard. They expected to return soon. If they launched the ship's boat on the leeward side, they could have tied it to the ship with a line, keeping close but at a safe distance. They could wait for the fumes to dissipate. They could watch for signs of fire or blast. Then they could reboard. But the ocean does not care about plans. A squall could return suddenly, rain, wind shifting fast in that region. If sails remained up and wind caught them just right, the Mary Celeste could surge forward. A boat tied to her might be dragged, swamped, or snapped loose. If the crew cut the line to save themselves, they would be left in open water with limited ability to chase a moving ship, especially if wind blew against their rowing. The Azores were near, but near in the Atlantic is a cruel word. A few miles can become impossible if wind and sea turn. If the wind pushed them away from land, away from the ship, out into open ocean, then their fate becomes terrifyingly simple. A small boat without support becomes hard to find. Even lifeboats from major disasters vanished into fog and never resurfaced in record. 10 souls in a ship's boat could disappear without leaving a trace, especially in that era. This scenario, temporary abandonment gone wrong, is not satisfying in a cinematic way. It has no villain. No grand reveal. It is simply the ocean exploiting a moment of human caution. It turns a reasonable decision into a fatal outcome. And that is exactly why it feels plausible. It also fits the ship's condition when found. The open skylight and water in the hold could result from rain and sea water entering after the crew left, especially if hatches were opened or compromised during the ventilation attempt. Over days, that could produce the 3.5 feet of water observed. Not catastrophic. Just enough to make the ship look neglected, sick, and wrong. And it fits the eerie detail of the ship's later drift. The Mary Celeste was found east of where she likely had been abandoned, but her exact path isn't perfectly known. Wind can turn a vessel. A ship can sail itself in circles, especially with sails partly set and no hand on the helm. The idea that she drifted back toward the scene, back toward where her people vanished, feels almost supernatural. But it's also the kind of cruel coincidence the sea produces naturally. The salvage hearing in Gibraltar dragged on. As scrutiny increased, testimonies shifted. Some sailors added details, claims of a disassembled pump on deck, improvised sounding rods, signs of panic. Were those details honest recollections resurfacing? Or were they attempts to align their story with what they believed the court wanted to hear, in order to avoid suspicion and secure salvage rights? The longer an investigation runs, the more human storytelling infects memory, especially when money is on the line. Ultimately, the Dei Gratia crew received a salvage award, around 20% of the ship's value. The cargo was found largely intact, though some leakage may have occurred. Winchester came to claim his vessel, and he was billed for various costs associated with the investigation and holding of the ship. He objected to some charges, especially as the process dragged for months, but paid what he had to in order to recover his property. By March of 1873, the proceedings concluded. The ship, under a new captain, completed the voyage to Italy. And you might think that would be the end. A mystery unsolved, filed away, replaced by the next disaster. But the Mary Celeste did not stop collecting tragedy. When she returned to New York in September 1873, Winchester tried to sell her. But reputation travels faster than ships. Newspapers had spread the story across the Atlantic world. Who wanted to buy a vessel whispered about as haunted? Sailors are practical, but they are also superstitious. Owners are practical too, and practical men do not want crews refusing to sign on because a ship is wrong. She was sold at a loss. Over the next years, she sailed mostly around the West Indies. And then, as if echoing her earliest days, death visited again. In 1879 she carried horses around Africa, the animals fell ill, many dying. Around the same period, a captain became sick, the ship docked, and he died within hours, another captain lost, another entry in the ship's grim ledger. Eventually the ship ended up under the ownership of a man named Wesley Gove. For years the vessel struggled to be profitable. Then, in 1884, a plan formed, one that would finally destroy the Mary Celeste deliberately, not by accident. An insurance scheme. The concept was simple and ancient: overinsure the cargo and vessel, then arrange a loss at sea. The last captain involved was named Parker, an uncanny symmetry, since a Captain Parker had also commanded the ship early in her life under the name Amazon. The crew, told of the plan, seemed to go along with it, perhaps out of greed, perhaps out of resignation, perhaps because some truly believed the ship carried a curse that needed to be ended. The intention was to wreck her at Turk's Island against deadly cliffs. The first mate argued against that plan: wrecking on cliffs would be certain death. Parker relented and chose a safer reef, well marked. The ship ran hard under full sail, surged forward, and grounded. The crew took what they wanted: alcohol, small goods, then abandoned her. And in doing so, Parker left behind something priceless: the ship's logbook. The log containing entries reaching back to Briggs's era. That book was lost as the wreck broke apart. What we know of earlier log details survives primarily because parts were quoted in the 1873 inquiry transcripts. The original vanished into the sea. Insurance investigators saw through the fraud. The supposed valuable cargo was exposed as junk, rotten fish, rancid ale, worthless goods. The scheme collapsed in court. The owner and crew were forced to return money to avoid prison, and to avoid a far darker charge. Intentionally wrecking a ship was a serious crime, one that, in earlier legal frameworks, could even carry a death penalty. And then the Mary Celeste's shadow reached out one final time. The men most responsible for her destruction, the owner, the captain, the first mate, were all dead within 6 months. 2 vessels involved in the investigation were chartered during the inquiry, and according to local accounts, both were later lost with all hands on their first voyage afterward. Stories like that are rocket fuel for superstition. Whether coincidence or something else, it cemented the ship's reputation as a carrier of misfortune. Back in Nova Scotia, where she had been born as Amazon, a monument now marks the connection. Spencer's Island, once a thriving shipbuilding place, retains fragments of its past, old foundations, surviving houses, and the lingering awareness that this quiet shoreline produced one of history's most infamous ghost ships. The Mary Celeste is often reduced to a single image, an empty deck under gray sky, sails hanging wrong, a ship that looks alive but feels abandoned. That image is powerful because it suggests an impossible pause in time, like the world blinked and 10 people vanished in the blink. But the real story, the one that breathes underneath the image, is not a single moment. It is a chain of ordinary days and ordinary choices stretched across years, threaded through economies and shipyards, family letters and insurance clauses, storms and cargo fumes. It is also a story about how quickly facts get swallowed by repetition, how the more a mystery is told, the less it resembles its own evidence. If you want to keep the substance intact, if you want the narrative to stay close to what can be supported, then you have to resist the temptation to solve it too quickly. You have to live inside the uncertainty long enough to understand what the ship was, what the sea was, and what the people on board would realistically have faced. Because there is one detail that matters more than almost any other, the Mary Celeste did not look like a ship that had been conquered by violence. Violence leaves fingerprints. Even in the 19th century, even in storms, even in chaos, a struggle tends to leave behind something that does not fit the rest. Broken furniture. Blood. Blades left out. Torn clothing. A lock smashed. A cabin ransacked with the indifference of someone who expects never to be questioned. Yet the reports from Gibraltar describe a ship that was wet and disordered in practical ways, like a ship that had endured weather, like a ship that had been lived in, like a ship that had been abandoned quickly, but not like one that had been fought over. That absence of struggle is a kind of evidence in itself. It does not tell you what happened, but it narrows the shape of what could have happened. A pirate raid, for instance, makes little sense if the cargo remained. Pirates did not risk boarding in the open Atlantic to leave behind valuable goods. A mutiny might explain why a captain disappears, but mutiny also tends to include a motive: food shortages, cruelty, unpaid wages, desperation, and even then, the mutineers usually take the ship somewhere. They do not vanish into the ocean and leave a seaworthy vessel drifting without leadership. A planned disappearance, likewise, collapses under the weight of Arthur Briggs, the 8-year-old son left behind in the care of grandparents. People love to imagine a romantic escape, a captain and his family vanishing into new identities on some island, living out the remainder of their lives under assumed names. But that story requires a level of coldness and coordination that does not fit what is known about Briggs or what is known about family life in that era. It also requires luck beyond reason, because even if you wanted to vanish, you would not choose to do it by abandoning a ship in the open Atlantic with a toddler. So if we treat the absence of violent evidence seriously, and we treat the family details seriously, we end up pushed toward a narrower class of explanations, ones that involve fear, miscalculation, and environmental force rather than human malice. And fear, in maritime life, is rarely abstract. Fear is usually rooted in something the body can sense: a smell, a sound, a vibration, a sudden change in the ship's behavior. In the Mary Celeste case, the cargo itself provides the most direct candidate for that kind of fear. The ship carried 171 barrels of alcohol. Not bottled drinking alcohol sealed in glass, but industrial spirit in wooden casks. Wooden casks are not perfect. They breathe. They leak. They expand and contract. Their staves shift under pressure and temperature changes. The atmosphere in the hold changes with weather and with latitude. Warmth makes vapors expand. Storms throw barrels so they press and rub and strain. If hatches stay closed for long periods, vapors accumulate. Now picture the passage in human terms. You are on a wooden vessel in the Atlantic in November. The air is cold and wet. The sea is restless. You are weeks from land. The ship lives and groans and flexes under load. You cannot simply go below and forget the cargo exists. Every sound of shifting weight is a reminder that below your feet is a sealed space full of something that could become dangerous. The crew of Dei Gratia reported that when they boarded Mary Celeste, storm coverings had been put up and windows boarded, signs of bad weather management. That suggests that Mary Celeste had indeed encountered heavy seas and had taken precautions. The skylight being propped open, however, was inconsistent with wanting to keep water out. It was an intentional opening. That matters. People do not prop open a skylight in the mid-Atlantic casually. They do it for ventilation, for air, for some urgent need. Ventilation fits perfectly with an alcohol fume scenario. So does the missing boat. So does the partial lowering of sails. So does the sense of haste without panic struggle. The most plausible shape of events is not that Briggs and his crew abandoned ship in the sense of giving up on survival. It is that they temporarily evacuated for what they believed was a safer position, expecting to return once the danger cleared. When people resist this scenario, they often do so emotionally. They think, why would experienced sailors ever leave a ship for a small boat? Because sailors understood risk in terms of what would kill them first. A ship is safer than a boat in most circumstances. But not in all. If you believed an explosion was possible, if you believed a fire could flash through the hull and turn your only refuge into a furnace, then the lifeboat becomes, briefly, the safer bet. This is not an exotic idea. Maritime history contains many moments where crews made choices that sound irrational only because we are reading them from dry land. People jump from burning ships into water full of debris. People abandon large vessels that are still afloat because they believe sinking is imminent. People cling to small craft because it feels like action, because waiting feels like death. If Briggs opened the hold to vent fumes and something frightened him, an abnormal whoosh of vapor, a sudden groaning of timbers, the suggestion of pressure released, the possibility of ignition, he may have made a conservative decision. Get everyone out. Put distance between the people and the ship. Let the hold clear. Return. That conservative decision could become fatal if the weather turned quickly. And the Atlantic is famous for turning quickly. A line could snap. A squall could blow the ship forward. The boat could be swamped. The distance between vessel and boat could widen beyond recovery within minutes. Even a few hundred yards in worsening conditions can become impossible. Once separated, the crew faces a nightmare, a drifting boat without navigation support, with a toddler aboard, pushed away from land by wind. The Mary Celeste, still partially under sail, continues without them. The sea erases the rest. It is a bleak explanation precisely because it is ordinary. It is the kind of tragedy that happens without villains. The ocean does not need villains. But now we have to confront a second problem, one that made the Mary Celeste story explode beyond maritime circles and enter popular imagination. Not simply the disappearance itself, but the fact that the ship's discoverers, Morehouse and his crew, had something to gain. Salvage law created a financial incentive. Find a valuable vessel in distress, bring it to port, and you can claim a portion of its value as reward. That reward was not small. A fully loaded ship could mean life-changing money. It could also mean suspicion. Courts had seen salvage fraud before. People staged discoveries. They manipulated evidence. They tried to make ships look more abandoned or more distressed to justify higher awards. In extreme cases, criminals intentionally created distress to salvage their own targets. So when the Dei Gratia crew brought the Mary Celeste into Gibraltar, authorities were primed to look at them as potential criminals. They were strangers in a foreign port showing up with a valuable vessel whose crew had vanished. They could not provide a body. They could not provide a coherent explanation. They could only offer a story: we found her, we boarded her, she was abandoned. Even if their story was entirely true, the incentive structure meant it would always be questioned. It is difficult to look altruistic when you are also profiting. This matters because the investigation itself may have shaped the story we now tell. When a court begins to suspect you, you unconsciously alter your narrative. You try to provide details that you believe will satisfy suspicion. You try to fill gaps. You emphasize certain evidence and forget other evidence. Human memory is not a recording device, it is a storyteller. Over time, the Dei Gratia cruise account gained additions, claims about tools on deck, about the condition of the pump, about how the Mary Celeste had been dangerously taking on water. Those details helped support an image of a crew forced to abandon because the ship seemed to be sinking. That image is more sympathetic to the idea that the crew vanished due to misfortune rather than due to something sinister. It also conveniently shifts attention away from salvage motives. If the Mary Celeste's crew abandoned ship because it seemed to be sinking, then the Dei Gratia crew are heroes for saving it. If, however, the Mary Celeste's crew had abandoned because of fumes or fear, then questions arise: why was it abandoned if it was not truly sinking? How could it drift so long? Where is the boat? Those questions are harder. But whether those later embellishments were lies or simply memory shaped by pressure is difficult to prove. The key point is that the court could not comfortably accept the story. They searched for murder. They searched for conspiracy. They searched for anything that would explain a mystery without forcing them to admit that sometimes the ocean produces mysteries without closure. And because they searched, rumors grew. Once rumors grow, the Mary Celeste becomes less a ship and more a symbol. The symbol begins to feed itself. Every later detail people remember becomes part of the symbol. Fresh food on the table. Tea still warm. A pipe still smoking. All of it nonsense, but all of it emotionally satisfying, because it paints abandonment as supernatural rather than practical. That is what Arthur Conan Doyle's 1884 story exploited. Doyle was not writing history, he was writing atmosphere. He took the bare bones of an already famous case and injected it with narrative ingredients designed to linger. He misspelled the ship's name as Mary Celeste, and that misspelling infected popular culture permanently. He added passengers. He added drama. He created an event that felt like horror. And the public, hungry for horror, accepted it as if it were fact. For 150 years, the Mary Celeste has suffered a second disappearance, the disappearance of her actual evidence under layers of storytelling. So if we return to the ship as a physical object, wood, rigging, cargo, water, we can see her story as a caution about how fragile truth is once it enters the human imagination. But Mary Celeste also endures because her story did not end in 1872. A ship with a singular mystery often fades after the mystery is filed away. Yet Mary Celeste continued, like a character that refuses to exit the stage, accumulating more misfortune and more narrative weight. When Winchester tried to sell her after she returned to New York, the ship's reputation made her toxic. Sailors talk. Port towns talk faster than newspapers. To sign onto a ship is to gamble your life on its seaworthiness and on its luck. Even the most rational mariner still carries a small superstition. Many will deny it. Many will mock it. But in private, when the sea is black and the wind is loud, superstition becomes an instinct. A bad ship is a thing men avoid. So Mary Celeste was sold at a loss. She worked, mostly in the West Indies. Work that was not glamorous. Work that was punishing. Work where profit margins were thin and storms were common. And then came the horses, sickening and dying. Then came another captain dying soon after docking at St. Helena. These events are not unique in maritime history. Ships carried disease. Men died. But in the context of Mary Celeste's reputation, every misfortune became proof. Proof that the ship was cursed. Proof that the ship was wrong. Eventually, the ship ended in deliberate fraud, wrecked for insurance. That final act was, in a strange way, the most human part of her story. Not mystery, not coincidence, but the familiar greed that ruins lives. The ship's last captain and owner did not fear superstition enough to avoid her. They feared poverty more. They saw the ship as an asset to be exploited, not as a haunted relic. The irony is that the end of the ship destroyed some of the best evidence that might have clarified her greatest mystery. The logbook that had once contained Briggs's writing, entries that would have provided crucial detail about the final days, was lost when Parker abandoned the ship during the insurance scam. If that log had survived, perhaps some note, some casual sentence, could have shifted the odds toward one theory. But history often works like that. It preserves the dramatic outline and destroys the missing pieces that would allow the outline to become a picture. So the Mary Celeste remains half picture, half shadow. And people, uncomfortable with half shadow, fill it with their own shapes. That is why the theories never stop. There is always a new suspect, a new scientific explanation, a new documentary promising a definitive solution. But the truth is, the case resists definitive solutions because the evidence was always limited, and what evidence did exist was damaged by time, storytelling, and the mechanical reality of salvage. Still, we can examine the ship-specific details more closely, because the details themselves tell us what kind of event could have happened. Not exactly what did happen, but what must have happened. First, the condition of the sails. When DeVoe boarded, he observed that sails were in disorder and at least some had been lowered in haste. That suggests the ship was not abandoned while fully under control in calm weather. It suggests a moment when the crew made changes quickly. Yet not all sails were lowered, indicating either lack of time or an intention to keep some sails set for stability or position. Second, the missing section of railing on the port side. This is consistent with launching a boat. To launch a boat from a deck in rough weather, you might remove or alter sections of rail to allow clearance. It is not a common choice without reason, but it is not impossible. Third, the open skylight. This is one of the most important details and also one of the most neglected in popular retellings. If you are trying to keep water out during storm conditions, you do not prop open a skylight. Doing so makes no sense. Unless you are trying to let something else out, or let fresh air in urgently. Ventilation again. Fourth, the water in the hold. 3.5 feet of water is significant, but not necessarily catastrophic. It does not imply the ship was sinking rapidly. It could have accumulated over days with hatches compromised or left open. It could have entered through opened hatches during ventilation attempts or through damage. The fact that the pumps were functional suggests the crew could have managed it if they were aboard, unless they believed other danger outweighed the flooding. Fifth, the state of personal belongings and provisions. Most possessions remained. Food and water remained. That indicates a departure expected to be temporary or a departure made under sudden fear rather than long planning. People planning to abandon permanently usually take more, especially valuables. People fleeing pirates sometimes leave things behind in haste, but pirates typically leave evidence, and pirates generally take valuables too. Neither fits cleanly here. Sixth, the log. Entries up to November 24th, with a partial slate entry for November 25th. That suggests something happened after November 24th and before the ship drifted long enough to be found. The gap is about 10 days. That is a long window for the ship to drift without being encountered. It also suggests that whatever happened occurred before the ship reached Gibraltar and before it met Dei Gratia. The ship's final position, where she was found relative to the Azores, matters, but ocean drift is complex. Still, the timeline is consistent with the idea that the crew vanished around November 25th. All these details align with a scenario of temporary evacuation gone wrong. And that scenario, though not glamorous, holds up because it requires the fewest assumptions. Occam's razor is often invoked lazily, but in this case it is genuinely useful. You do not need pirates, conspiracies, or supernatural forces. You need only fumes, fear, a boat, a line, a squall. Yet, there is also room for nuance. Because alcohol fumes alone might not have been the only trigger. Maritime events often involve multiple stressors piling up until a decision becomes inevitable. For example, structural concerns. A ship that has been heavily rebuilt might flex differently under strain. A crew hearing unusual sounds from below might interpret them as structural failure rather than vapor pressure changes. A sounding rod might show unusual water levels. A pump might behave strangely under certain conditions. Combine that with the presence of a family on board and the psychological fatigue of storms, and a captain's tolerance for uncertainty collapses quickly. Another possibility is that the crew was responding not just to fumes but to a perceived danger of explosion. Alcohol vapor is flammable. If the crew feared that opening the hold and exposing fumes to a flame could ignite, they might extinguish lamps, open ventilation points, and evacuate. The open skylight becomes even more meaningful. It also suggests why the crew might not reboard quickly. They might wait until they felt absolutely sure conditions were safe. But waiting becomes dangerous when wind shifts. Still another possible stressor is navigation uncertainty. The Mary Celeste was close enough to the Azores to imagine reaching land with a boat in ideal conditions. That hope could have influenced the decision to evacuate. If Briggs believed Santa Maria was within reach, he might have thought the boat was a manageable fallback. But wind and current might have made it impossible. In most tragedies, people act based on what they think will happen, not what will happen. That is the pivot. Now, as the story moved forward into public consciousness, the Gibraltar hearing did something else. It cast a shadow over the Dei Gratia crew that never fully lifted. Even though they received salvage, even though there was no definitive proof of foul play, suspicion lingered. The idea that 3 men could sail the Mary Celeste into port seemed almost too efficient. Some observers could not accept it as simple seamanship. They saw it as evidence of prior involvement. They imagined that Morehouse had known where the ship would be. They imagined he had arranged it. They imagined he had murdered Briggs and then waited for the ship to drift. But again, these theories collapse when you treat the Atlantic as an environment rather than a stage. Coordinating an ambush at sea, without modern communication, with uncertain routes, with storms, is nearly impossible. The pilot of a plane can select a route, the way D.B. Cooper's pilot did, but a sailing captain cannot choose the wind and current with that precision. If the Mary Celeste had been targeted by an accomplice, we would expect signs of a struggle or at least signs of deliberate interference. We do not have them. The simpler answer is, the Dei Gratia crew were opportunistic salvors who stumbled upon a fortune, and their excitement was more about money than about missing souls. That may sound cold. It is cold. But the 19th century maritime economy was harsh. Sailors and captains were not always sentimental in the way modern retellings expect. Salvage was a prize. A prize could change a man's life. It is possible to be shocked by tragedy and excited by profit at the same time. Human beings contain contradictions easily. The Mary Celeste, then, becomes not just a ghost ship but a mirror. It reflects the roughness of the era that produced her. It reflects how communities built ships out of timber and debt. It reflects how captains carried families into danger because that was the only way to live together. It reflects how courts searched for villains because admitting randomness felt intolerable. It reflects how writers turned uncertainty into horror because horror sells. And it reflects how, once a story becomes famous, the truth becomes less important than the feeling it creates. Yet for all of that, the ship's original human heart remains the same. 10 people, including a woman and a child, vanished into the Atlantic. It is easy to romanticize that disappearance. It is easy to treat it as entertainment. But if you strip away the myth, you are left with something that should make your stomach sink. Somewhere beyond sight of land, in cold water and rough wind, a small boat may have struggled for hours or days. People who expected to return to their ship may have watched it pull away, unable to catch it, unable to shout loudly enough to matter. A toddler crying. A mother trying to calm her while hiding her own panic. Men rowing until their arms broke down, until the sea beat their strength into nothing. And then silence. No record. No grave. Just the ship continuing. That is the real darkness of the Mary Celeste. Not ghosts. Not curses. But the sea's ability to erase people so completely that it looks, from a distance, like magic. And if that wasn't enough, the ship's story loops back to where it began, Nova Scotia, the Bay of Fundy, the kind of place where people have always understood that the ocean takes what it wants. Even the Amazon years carry that theme. The death of Captain McClellan. The collision in Dover Strait. The suspected scam by Captain Thompson. The repeated wrecks and sails. The ship, long before she became Mary Celeste, already behaved like a vessel that could not stop colliding with human misfortune. But misfortune in maritime life is sometimes just frequency. A ship that sails enough will encounter events. A ship that changes hands frequently may suffer from neglect. A ship tied to marginal finances may cut corners, hire rougher crews, risk more dangerous routes. In other words, the ship may not have been cursed at all. It may simply have been a vessel that was always one bad decision away from disaster because of the economic pressures surrounding her. When she became Mary Celeste, she was already old in ship terms, built in 1861, found abandoned in 1872, more than a decade into a hard-working life. She had been rebuilt extensively. She had a complicated paperwork history. She had moved between ports and owners. She had, in a sense, been patched not only with timber but with desperation. And that context matters because a patched ship makes different noises. A patched ship leaks differently. A patched ship, under storm stress, might produce sensations that would alarm even experienced sailors, especially if the captain's family is aboard. If Briggs did not fully trust the ship's integrity, he might have interpreted normal ship stress as imminent catastrophe. What happened, then, could have been a collision between a ship's physical reality and a captain's moral responsibility. Briggs could have stayed aboard and risked catastrophe. Or he could have evacuated and risked separation. Both choices carry risk. He chose the one that, in the moment, seemed to protect his family. The tragedy is that the sea punished him for being cautious. This is often how tragedies work. Not because a person is foolish, but because they are reasonable under uncertainty. And the sea is the ultimate environment of uncertainty. Now, if we step forward again into the aftermath, we find another reason the Mary Celeste story grew monstrous: timing. The inquiry concluded in March 1873, and soon after, another major disaster captured public attention: the wreck of the White Star liner Atlantic near Halifax in April 1873. That wreck killed hundreds. It was horrific. It dominated headlines. It pushed Mary Celeste's story out of the news cycle. Yet the Mary Celeste did not vanish from culture. Instead, she moved into the deep layer of storytelling that exists beneath daily news, the layer where mysteries ferment. People continued to talk. Writers continued to rewrite. Each retelling simplified the facts and sharpened the eerie points. Within decades, the Mary Celeste was no longer a complicated maritime case. She was the ghost ship. The archetype. And once a story becomes archetype, it is nearly impossible to rescue the original evidence. Every attempt to tell it faithfully must fight against the audience's expectation of supernatural horror. That is why a true Mary Celeste documentary has to do something unusual. It has to be willing to disappoint the myth. It has to be willing to say, the ship was not found with food still warm. The log did not stop mid-sentence at the moment of discovery. The crew of Dei Gratia were not necessarily friends of Briggs, and their conduct was not necessarily noble. The sea did not need a monster. The ocean did the work itself. Yet, if you tell it that way, if you tell it as a human tragedy shaped by practical hazards, it becomes darker in a different way. Because it becomes relatable. It becomes possible. And a mystery that could happen again is more frightening than a mystery that requires ghosts. Somewhere, even now, there are ships lost without explanation. Not wooden brigantines anymore, but vessels that vanish from tracking for hours, days, weeks. Sometimes they are found. Sometimes they are not. The modern world has radar, satellites, radios. Yet the ocean remains enormous, and it still swallows evidence. Mary Celeste is a reminder that the sea is not a place where stories resolve neatly. It is a place where stories stop. And we, uncomfortable with stopping, invent endings. If you want to keep the essence of your original text, but make it darker and more mysterious in tone, the true power is not in inventing a monster. The true power is in building dread from reality, from the way the Atlantic behaves, from the way a ship sounds at night, from the way a crew would think when fumes rise and the deck creaks like something alive, from the way a captain looks at his sleeping child and decides that he cannot gamble. The Mary Celeste is not a ghost story. It is a story about panic without violence. About disappearance without struggle. About the thin line between safety and death. About how quickly a ship can slip away from the hands that built it. And about how, once it does, the ocean keeps its secrets. The last known handwriting of Captain Benjamin Briggs sits like a closed door in the archive. Not because it contains a secret sentence that would solve the case, but because it is the last ordinary proof that the voyage was still a voyage, still routine enough for a captain to write as captains always did: position, weather, the kind of notes that seem small until they become the edge of a cliff. After that edge, the ocean takes over. To understand what it means for a ship to be found drifting, in near-perfect condition, you have to stop imagining a modern vessel, sealed compartments, engines, radios, steel hull, and instead picture a wooden body that breathes. Wood expands. Wood shrinks. Seams open and close with temperature and pressure. Salt works into grain like time. Water does not need an invitation, it only needs a weakness. The Mary Celeste, even after her refit, was still a product of hand tools and human judgment. She was not a machine, she was a compromise between design and reality. And when you live on such a vessel long enough, you develop a sense for what is normal. That sense is crucial, because whatever happened on the morning of November 25, 1872, if that date truly marks the turning point, likely began as a deviation from normal. A smell that had grown stronger than it should. A groan from below that sounded wrong. A pressure change that made the ship complain in a way that felt unfamiliar. The subtle terror of realizing that something you cannot see is changing. That kind of fear is different from the fear of an attacker. It is quiet. It is private. It is the fear of a threat that cannot be negotiated with. If you believe the hold is becoming hazardous, you do not gather your crew in the galley and hold a vote. You move. You do not have time to build consensus. You do what you think a captain must do: protect life first, property second. And that principle, so easy to say on land, becomes devastating when it collides with the one truth of the Atlantic: property is the thing that keeps you alive. A ship is shelter, water storage, navigation, food, warmth, structure, and hope. To step into a small boat is to step out of your world. So why do it? Because sometimes the world you are standing in starts to feel like a trap. Imagine the scene in practical steps. The weather breaks just enough to permit action. The crew has been battered by storms, sleep broken, bodies bruised by the ship's movement, nerves worn down by constant vigilance. The captain knows his cargo. Alcohol in barrels is not just valuable, it is volatile. Weeks of closed hatches can make a hold feel like a sealed lung. Briggs may have noted the rumblings in the hold earlier in the voyage, the way a man notes a strange sound in his own home. You do not always act at the first sign. You watch. You wait. You hope the sign is meaningless. But then you hit the moment where hope no longer feels like a strategy. So you act. The crew works the hatches. Boards are moved. Canvas is adjusted. Ventilation begins. The skylight is propped open, not carelessly but deliberately, to give the trapped interior a path to breathe. Rainwater can come later, air is needed now. At first, it might feel like relief. Then the ship groans. A wooden hull under internal pressure can make sounds that feel alive. There is an ugliness to a ship's voice when it is stressed. Timber does not squeak like a door. It complains with depth, with weight, with a sense of strain that is hard to describe. If the hold had built pressure from fumes, releasing that pressure might have produced a sudden, startling exhale, an audible shift that made the crew freeze and look at each other. And in the freezing moment, human imagination does what it always does in danger, it jumps to the worst version. Explosion. Fire. Flash. A child burning before you can reach her. A man's rational mind can measure risk. But a father's mind, when faced with a vague threat near his child, will often choose certainty over calculation. A small boat is not safe in an absolute sense, but it is safe from an explosion aboard the main hull. At least temporarily. So the boat is prepared. To launch a boat from a ship is not trivial in rough water. You need room. You need clearance. You need to remove obstacles. That missing portion of railing on the port side begins to make sense. It is not evidence of violence, it is evidence of logistics. The crew might drop some sails quickly, not to abandon the ship but to slow her, to keep her from running away under wind. But the wind is not a tool you control with certainty. A sail that catches at the wrong time can pull a ship forward like a startled animal. In the moment, you do what you can, fast, under stress. Now the question becomes, why leave the ship tethered? Because cutting loose immediately would mean giving up the ship. And if the entire plan is to wait out danger and then return, you keep a line. The ship becomes an anchor, and the boat becomes a temporary refuge. A few hundred feet of separation feels reasonable. In calm weather, you can row back. You can pull yourself back along the line. You can climb aboard and resume. But reasonable is a word that only belongs on land. At sea, what is reasonable can become lethal in 10 minutes. A squall arrives, rain, wind shift, sudden force. The ship, still partly under sail, begins to move. The boat tugs on the line. The line tightens. The men in the boat must make a decision instantly, stay attached and risk being swamped or dragged, or cut the line and lose the ship. If they stay attached and the ship surges, the boat can be pulled sideways into waves. A small craft can flip, especially if it is overloaded with 10 people. And 10 people is a brutal load for a boat in rough conditions. If they flip, the ocean takes them quickly, hypothermia, exhaustion, drowning. If they cut loose, they are alive, but they are now alone. Alone is sometimes a slower death. Because the Azores are not a guarantee. Distance is deceptive at sea. 6 miles in calm water can feel near, 6 miles against wind and current can be impossible. A boat that cannot make headway becomes a hostage to weather. It drifts, pushed by forces too large to fight. And the Mary Celeste, emptied of human hands, becomes a creature of the same forces. She drifts too. She turns. She moves with current. She may even sail, semi-controlled by whatever sail remains set, like a blind animal still walking because it has not yet learned it is dead. Days pass. The boat, if it remains afloat, becomes smaller each hour, not physically, but psychologically. Everything becomes about water, about keeping waves out, about keeping a toddler from slipping, about rationing whatever was taken. A mother's voice becomes raw. Men's hands blister and bleed. A child's cries become intermittent, then quiet. There is a particular cruelty in how quickly human life becomes silent at sea. The ship, meanwhile, continues. This is the heart of why the Mary Celeste story feels unnatural. We are not disturbed merely because people vanished, we are disturbed because the ship did not. It remained to haunt the imagination. The vessel survived long enough to testify against the universe, to imply that there should have been time, that the crew should have returned, that they should have been found. But, should is a lie in maritime history. Ships survive when people do not, and people survive when ships do not, with no moral logic behind it. The ocean is not a judge. It is a system. When Captain David Morehouse saw the drifting vessel from the deck of Dei Gratia, he did not see a supernatural omen. He saw an opportunity wrapped in danger. A derelict ship is never simply a prize, it is also a trap. It can be damaged in invisible ways. It can be half-sunk. It can roll unexpectedly. It can kill the men who board it. But the potential reward was too large to ignore. This is where the story becomes morally complicated in a way that modern tellings often avoid. People prefer simple heroes and villains. They want the salvers to be noble rescuers or murderous conspirators, nothing in between. But in reality, the salvers were working men in an unforgiving economy. They could be competent, cautious, and greedy all at once. They could feel a flicker of dread and still think first of money. And when they stepped onto Mary Celeste's deck and found no one, the absence itself became a kind of permission. No bodies meant no responsibility, only reward. The first actions taken aboard, the pump check, the hold measurement, the cabin inspection, suggest not a search for survivors but an assessment of value. Is she manageable? Can she be sailed? Can we bring her in? Can we prove enough distress to win salvage? And that last question matters because the salvage hearing in Gibraltar was never purely about truth. It was about law and money. Courts had to determine how heroic the salvage was, how dangerous, how valuable. The more perilous the retrieval, the higher the award. The more abandoned and at risk the vessel, the more impressive the salvage. So the men were incentivized, consciously or unconsciously, to shape the narrative in a way that made the ship seem more endangered. If the court believed Mary Celeste was nearly sinking, that the crew had abandoned in panic over flooding, then Dei Gratia's salvers looked like they saved not just property but a life-sized asset from the jaws of the ocean. If, however, the court believed Mary Celeste was simply drifting with manageable water and workable pumps, then the salvage seems less heroic, more like a lucky find. Luck pays less. Suspicion also pays less. So story and incentive begin to entwine, and once they entwine, the record becomes unreliable in small ways. A detail becomes emphasized. Another detail is remembered. The timeline tightens. The condition becomes exaggerated. Not necessarily because of malice, sometimes because of the strange human need to be believed. And in the background sits the simplest cruelty of all: nobody knows where the boat went, and nobody can prove that they even left on one. But the missing boat is hard evidence. It is the one clean absence. It is not a ghostly hint, it is a physical fact. You do not misplace a ship's boat at sea unless it has been launched or torn away by force. If a wave ripped it loose, there would likely be damage, rope ends, splintering, signs of violence on the davits. But accounts lean toward deliberate launching rather than accidental loss. Deliberate launching implies intention. Intention implies reason. Reason implies fear. Fear implies something on the ship felt wrong. This is why the fume theory remains so persuasive. It fits fear without requiring an attacker. It explains ventilation choices. It explains haste without theft. It explains why a captain who had sailed his whole life might make a decision that looks, from land, like madness. It also aligns with how humans treat invisible threats. A man can stare at a wave and judge it. A man can see fire and flee it. But fumes, pressure, the possibility of ignition, these are threats that exist in the mind as much as in the environment. They feel unpredictable, and unpredictability triggers the most ancient human instinct: get away. Once the ship was brought into Gibraltar, the mystery became a public object. Authorities searched the vessel for signs of blood. A sword was found and briefly treated as a dramatic clue until tests showed no blood. That small moment is symbolic of the entire Mary Celeste story, a temptation toward violence, quickly rejected by reality. Reality, however, did not satisfy the public. It rarely does. So the story began to rot into myth. Every retelling added flavor. Many of those additions were designed not to clarify but to intensify. Meals left on the table were the perfect detail because they suggested immediate disappearance, a magical interruption of life. It is cinematic. It is haunting. It is also untrue. What was true was less exciting in a superficial sense: wet bedding, disorder from storm life, practical signs of coping with bad weather. That kind of truth does not sell. It does not feel like horror. It feels like work. But the most terrifying mysteries are often born from work. From routine. From a day that begins like any other and ends as a gap in the archive. Captain Briggs was not a reckless man. Everything known about him suggests discipline and temperament. His decision to bring his wife and child indicates not recklessness but trust in his own seamanship and his ship. He likely believed the voyage to Genoa would be a manageable crossing, a professional undertaking. He wrote letters. He played music. He thought about his son. These are not the habits of someone planning to vanish or to stage drama. They are the habits of a man living within a hard world and doing his best to keep it human. Which makes the likely end even darker. Because if Briggs's last days were dominated by fear of his cargo and the ocean, then the Mary Celeste mystery is not a story of strange people. It is a story of ordinary people trapped in extraordinary circumstance. The terror is that this could happen to a competent captain. That a man could do everything right and still lose everything. That is the kind of lesson the sea loves. When the Mary Celeste returned to service after Gibraltar, her reputation followed her like a stain. A ship's reputation is not a rational thing, but it has real economic consequences. Insurance becomes more difficult. Crews become harder to hire. Owners become desperate enough to cut corners. Corners cut at sea become cracks, and cracks become leaks, and leaks become disasters. Superstition becomes self-fulfilling. A haunted ship attracts the kind of ownership that does not care about haunting. Then, at the end, a man decided to destroy her for money. There is something almost ritualistic about that. A ship that became a legend for being found empty was finally made empty on purpose. A ship that inspired wild theories was reduced to fraud and rotten cargo. The romance evaporated into bureaucracy. The ocean reclaimed the wood, and the logbook vanished, and the last link to Captain Briggs's voice went down with it. Yet the legend refused to die. Because even if you tell the story with strict devotion to evidence, you still end with a blank space large enough to swallow imagination. The boat. The people. The precise moment of separation. The weather that turned. The sound that triggered fear. All of it is missing. And missing pieces are magnets. This is why the Mary Celeste sits at the intersection of documentary truth and ghost story appetite. If you lean too hard into myth, you betray the human tragedy. If you lean too hard into dry fact, you lose the audience. The art is to tell the truth in a way that feels like dread. And dread, in this story, is not supernatural. It is atmospheric. It is the weight of the Atlantic. It is the sound of a hull flexing at night. It is the intimate terror of standing on deck and realizing you are far from help, and the thing that might kill you is not an enemy you can fight, but an element you cannot reason with. The Mary Celeste was born in a place that understood those elements. The Bay of Fundy is not romantic water. It is working water. It is tide and mud and cold. It is a place where communities built ships because that was the economy, and because every ship was also a gamble. When Joshua Dewis and the Spicers built Amazon, they were not building a myth. They were building a tool. And tools, in harsh economies, are used until they break. The Amazon story alone reads like a warning. A new ship's first captain dies almost immediately. The vessel suffers mishaps, collisions, entanglements, and then a suspicious wreck that looks less like fate and more like human dishonesty. The ship changes names, flags, registrations, and owners like a man changing clothes to evade debt. She is rebuilt, repurposed, papered over, and finally sent to sea again under a new name, with new hopes pinned to old timber. The dark documentary version of this story is not one where the ship is cursed by ghosts. It is one where the ship is cursed by economics, by the constant pressure to extract value from something fragile, to push it farther, to load it heavier, to sail it later into the season, to gamble against storms because profit requires risk. And then one morning, the gamble collapses into a decision: open the hold, vent the fumes, get your family away from danger. The ocean decides the rest. After the disappearance, investigators in Gibraltar likely felt something that modern viewers rarely consider: embarrassment. A powerful institution hates mysteries that imply helplessness. A court, an empire, a port authority, these are systems built to project control. An empty ship drifting into their jurisdiction makes them look weak. It suggests that the sea can disrupt the logic of law. So they looked for a human cause, because humans can be punished. Pirates can be hunted. Murderers can be hanged. Conspirators can be exposed. But a squall and a snapped line cannot be tried in court. The end result is a familiar human pattern: when confronted with a mystery that feels intolerable, we invent motives to make it digestible. We turn accident into plot. We turn misfortune into villainy. We turn the sea into a stage for human drama because the alternative, that the sea can erase people without meaning, is too bleak. Yet that bleakness is the true shadow at the center of the Mary Celeste story. A ship continues on. 10 lives do not. And the world, unable to accept that imbalance, tells the story again and again, hoping that repetition will turn the blank space into a shape. It never fully does. That is why, even after 150 years, the case still feels fresh. Not because new evidence keeps appearing, but because the human mind keeps returning to the same question: what could make people step off their world into the void? The dark documentary version of this story is not one where the ship is cursed by ghosts. It is one where the ship is cursed by economics, by the constant pressure to extract value from something fragile, to push it farther, to load it heavier, to sail it later into the season, to gamble against storms because profit requires risk. And then one morning, the gamble collapses into a decision: open the hold, vent the fumes, get your family away from danger. The ocean decides the rest. After the disappearance, investigators in Gibraltar likely felt something that modern viewers rarely consider: embarrassment. A powerful institution hates mysteries that imply helplessness. A court, an empire, a port authority, these are systems built to project control. An empty ship drifting into their jurisdiction makes them look weak. It suggests that the sea can disrupt the logic of law. So they looked for a human cause, because humans can be punished. Pirates can be hunted. Murderers can be hanged. Conspirators can be exposed. But a squall and a snapped line cannot be tried in court. The end result is a familiar human pattern: when confronted with a mystery that feels intolerable, we invent motives to make it digestible. We turn accident into plot. We turn misfortune into villainy. We turn the sea into a stage for human drama because the alternative, that the sea can erase people without meaning, is too bleak. Yet that bleakness is the true shadow at the center of the Mary Celeste story. A ship continues on. 10 lives do not. And the world, unable to accept that imbalance, tells the story again and again, hoping that repetition will turn the blank space into a shape. It never fully does. That is why, even after 150 years, the case still feels fresh. Not because new evidence keeps appearing, but because the human mind keeps returning to the same question: what could make people step off their world into the void?